All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're going to tackle a tough but absolutely crucial topic. Where does sectarian division in the Muslim world actually come from? I mean, how did one single faith split into factions that are still at odds today? We're going to dig into the historical texts themselves, guided by some really solid scholarly research, to try and find the source of these deep, deep divisions. And look, to really understand why this matters so much, just listen to this quote from our source material. This isn't some dusty, abstract theological debate. We're talking about something with very real life or death consequences. As the quote says, it's killing us, literally. So yeah, the stakes could not be higher. So here's our game plan for breaking this all down. First, we'll look at why this is such a massive problem. Then we'll get into the three core disputes at the heart of it all. After that, we'll examine another case of contradiction to see just how deep these issues go. And finally, we'll talk about a potential path forward. All right, Section 1. Let's start by understanding the stakes and why our source material actually describes this as a very high-impact problem. Okay, so before we go any further, let's make sure we're all on the same page. What are we actually talking about when we say sectarianism? Well, at its core, it's when a religious group splits up into these opposing sides. And for what we're looking at today, those splits came from arguments over who should lead and, most importantly, how to interpret the core religious texts. The research we're digging into here doesn't pull any punches. It gives sectarianism an impact rating of very high. And why? Well, it's because it's not seen as just some internal religious squabble. Nope. It's viewed as a key piece in a much larger web of systemic problems that really hold people back. And here they are, what the research calls the Big Five problems: poverty, brain drain, authoritarianism, patriarchy, and politicization. Now pay close attention to that fifth one. The argument is that the politicization of religion is the direct spark that ignites sectarianism, which in turn just makes all those other problems a whole lot worse. It's a really vicious cycle. And this brings us to a huge paradox, right at the center of this whole topic. On the one hand, you've got the Quran, the primary holy book of Islam, which comes right out and says that splitting into sects is wrong. But on the other hand, the research argues that the actual roots of this division are found in the literature that came after the Quran, specifically the collections of traditions known as the Hadith. This tension is exactly what we're going to unpack. So that leads us right into Section 2. And this is really the investigative heart of our explainer. We're about to get into the three core textual disputes that, according to the research, created the very fault lines of the Sunni-Shia divide. And these fault lines can really be traced back to three crucial points of disagreement. First, a dispute over what was actually said in the Prophet's final sermon. Second, the interpretation of a specific tradition known as the Ghadir Hadith. And third, the tricky meaning of one single, incredibly important Arabic word, Mawla. So here's the first major split. You see two totally different versions of the Prophet's final message. According to Sunni sources, the message was, follow the Quran and my example, the Sunnah. But the Shia tradition holds that in that same sermon, the Prophet specifically appointed his cousin and son-in-law, Ali, as a leader. I mean, think about that. These are two completely different roadmaps for the community's future, both claiming to come from the exact same historical moment. This brings us right to the second point of contention, which builds on the first. The story goes that after the final sermon, the Prophet is said to have stopped at a place called Ghadir Khum, which is a pond. And it's here, according to Shia tradition, that he made a monumental declaration about who was meant to lead after him. And this is it. This is the sentence at the absolute center of the Ghadir Khum Hadith. Of whomever I am the Mawla, Ali is his Mawla too. It seems like a simple sentence, right? But this one line would become one of the most pivotal and hotly debated statements in Islamic history. So this makes you wonder, doesn't it? If this was the moment the Prophet named his successor, why isn't this event mentioned in the two most revered Sunni Hadith collections, those of Bukhari and Muslim? The research points out that while other reliable Sunni texts do mention it, its complete absence from the top two is a huge point of contention for scholars. But even if you accept that the Ghadir Khum event happened, you run smack into another huge problem. What does the word Mawla actually mean? This is what the source calls a dictionary problem. For Shias, it means master or patron, which points to a clear transfer of leadership. For Sunnis, it means something more like friend or protege, a statement of affection, not succession. So this massive theological and political split literally pivots on how you interpret one ambiguous word. Okay, moving into our third section. we're going to look at another case of textual contradiction. Now, this isn't one of the core disputes about succession, but it does an amazing job of showing just how challenging and internally inconsistent the Hadith literature can be. So in Sunni Hadith collections, there's a very well-known report saying the Prophet specifically named 10 of his companions and promised them they would enter paradise. This list includes some of the most revered figures in early Islamic history. But here's the logical puzzle the research points out. The Hadith promises paradise to these 10 individuals. Yet historical records confirm that some of these very same people later fought and even killed each other on opposing sides during the First Muslim Civil War. So the analysis asks a pretty sharp question. How could people who are guaranteed a spot in heaven be on opposite sides of a bloody conflict, where at least one side was arguably in the wrong? Now, as you can probably guess, the Shia tradition rejects this hadith, and for a couple of key reasons. First, it's considered a solitary report, meaning it has only a single chain of narrators, which is seen by many as too weak to establish a major belief. Second, and this is a big one, critics point out that the person who narrated this report actually included his own name on the list of 10, which definitely raises questions about potential bias. So, after digging through all these deep textual splits, the question has to be, is there a path forward? In our final section, we're going to look at a solution proposed in the source material, a modern intellectual framework it calls BioIslam. So, what exactly is BioIslam? The source material defines it as scientific Islam. Now, this doesn't mean mixing religion with lab coats or anything like that. It refers to a modern perspective that applies critical analysis, reason, and historical methods to religious texts. The goal isn't to declare a winner in the Sunni-Shia debate, but to propose a way to move beyond these traditional and conflicting identities entirely. This framework's position really rests on 4 connected ideas. Let's walk through them. First, you consciously reject the traditional labels like Sunni and Shia, arguing they just perpetuate division. Second, you have to acknowledge that post-Quranic texts like the Hadith were compiled by fallible human beings centuries after the events, so they might contain errors or contradictions. Third, and this is a huge step, you accept that absolute 100% certainty on these ancient disputes just isn't possible for us today. And all of that leads to the fourth and most important point. Recenter the faith on the one text that is considered certain and divinely preserved, the Quran, and prioritize its clear, direct condemnation of sectarianism over all the ambiguous and disputed historical reports that fuel it. And this brings us to our final thought. The research we've looked at today shows, in detail, how disputes over ambiguous, contradictory, and historically uncertain texts have fueled centuries of division. So the question the source material leaves us with is this. If these secondary texts just lead to unsolvable arguments, what then is the most reliable and most unifying foundation for faith?